Hello, and welcome to Policy Street. I'm Amina Wanjiku. Today, we're digging into a phrase you've probably heard everywhere in Kenyan headlines. Ruto wants to turn Kenya into Singapore. But what does that actually mean? And is it even possible? With me are two guests who know these questions inside out. Dr. David Olo, political economist, and Serena Tan Weiling, governance analyst from Singapore. David, Serena, great to have you both.
Thanks, Amina. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Amina. Glad to join.
So let's start with the basics. President William Ruto has been invoking Singapore as a model for Kenya. Discipline in public finance, anti-corruption, efficient bureaucracy. But the language has shifted since his campaign. David, can you map that rhetorical shift for our listeners?
Sure. During the 2022 campaign, Ruto leaned heavily on the hustler nation narrative. He presented himself as someone who champions the informal sector and ordinary traders. That narrative emphasized lowering the cost of living and easing daily burdens on the poor. Once in office, though, the emphasis moved toward fiscal consolidation, higher taxes, broader tax bases, and IMF-friendly reforms. In short, the messaging shifted from relief to sacrifice. We must endure pain now for future prosperity. And Singapore became the shorthand to justify that shift.
Right, so campaign hustler to in-office disciplinarian.
If I may add, Amina, Singapore is often used as a rhetorical symbol because it's a simple, powerful success story. Rapid transformation from a poor, resource-poor island into a high-income hub in a generation. But Singapore's model is multidimensional and includes political trade-offs that people often gloss over when invoking it as inspiration.
Let's unpack those dimensions. Serena, give us a concrete snapshot. When folks say Singapore, what are the real ingredients behind that label?
Okay, in broad strokes, first, strong centralized state capacity with technocratic planning agencies like Singapore's Economic Development Board or Housing and Development Board, which have real authority to plan and execute. Second, an anti-corruption architecture. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau has teeth and a track record of going after senior figures. Third, strategic economic policy that welcomed foreign investment and focused on logistics, port services, advanced manufacturing, and later finance and tech. And fourth, a social contract that trades some political freedoms for predictable delivery, managed media, limited tolerance for street protest, and a dominant party system under the PAP.
So it's not only about clean ministers or new factories. It's a package deal. Governance, enforcement, social discipline. David, for Kenya to become Singapore, what structural gaps jump out at you?
Several. First, Kenya is a large, diverse state with a big rural population, heavy reliance on agriculture, and a sprawling informal sector, very different from a compact, hyper-urban city-state. Second, Kenya's institutions face chronic problems: corruption, ethnicized patronage in appointments, and a civil service that in many places lacks the high pay and merit systems Singapore uses to attract top talent. Third, Kenya has a history of protest, competitive multi-party politics, and coalition bargaining, all structural constraints on any attempt to centralize decision-making the way Singapore did.
You said ethnicized patronage and competitive politics. Serena, from Singapore's point of view, could a small city-state model ever be transplanted to a country like Kenya without fundamentally changing political norms?
Transplantation is the wrong word because context matters so much. Singapore's compact geography, its maritime advantage, and historical path after 1965 allowed the state to concentrate resources and set stringent incentives. Political norms were shaped by a dominant party over decades. In Kenya, any attempt to build capability while simultaneously suppressing dissent runs the risk of becoming illiberal without delivering the predictable competence that underpins Singapore's legitimacy. So you either replicate the full package, including the political trade-offs, or you won't get the same outcome.
David, Ruto has used the Singapore example often. But there's also his track record to contend with, the ICC history, long presence in the political class, questions about corruption. How does that record sit with the kind of leadership Singapore's founders had?
It's a stark contrast. Lee Kuan Yew and the early PAP leadership built a reputation for disciplining the political class and tolerating very little in terms of corruption. The CPIB instituted prosecutions that created credible fear of consequences. Ruto's political biography includes being a long-time operator within Kenya's elite politics, and his ICC indictment from the post-2007 violence era, although the case collapsed, contributes to a public perception of hardball politics. More importantly, under his watch, visible elite privilege and limited high-level accountability undermine the image of a leader willing to enforce discipline on his own allies the way Singaporean leaders did.
Serena, interrupting you a bit there, are you seeing any signs that Ruto is actually building the institutional meat and bones, anti-corruption enforcement, civil service reforms, discipline in policing, or is it mostly rhetoric?
The source material suggests a mixed picture. There's rhetorical emphasis on lifestyle audits, digitization, and banning certain patronage practices, but the evidence of systemic change is thin. Anti-corruption talk exists, but few high-level prosecutions or asset recoveries have altered public perception. At the same time, the state has shown a pattern of repression, police killings, deaths in custody, and bans on live coverage, which creates the appearance of heavy-handedness without the compensating gains in institutional cleanliness or predictable enforcement that Singapore enjoys.
Wow.
And to add, Amina, the fiscal context matters a lot. Kenya entered Ruto's presidency with high public debt, estimates around 65 to 70% of GDP, and a significant portion of revenue already going to debt servicing. That creates a fiscal squeeze that, rightly or wrongly, pushes the government toward raising revenue and cutting deficits. But the way you do that matters. If you raise taxes perceived as regressive while the visible elite continue to live lavishly, you get a legitimacy crisis.
Let's drill into those tax measures. The Finance Bill 2024 is probably the clearest example of this friction. David, can you summarize the key elements of what was being proposed and why it blew up?
The Finance Bill 2024 included a package of tax measures, widening the income tax base with new brackets, increasing excise and VAT on some goods, a 2.5% tax on motor vehicles, and initial proposals for green levies, and the inclusion of certain manufactured imports under new duties, items that many saw as hitting ordinary families. Earlier, other measures like VAT on fuel going from 8 to 16%, raising the turnover tax, and a warrant housing levy had already increased the cost burden. The public perception, intensified by social media, was that ordinary Kenyans were being squeezed while elite waste and corruption persisted. That perception fueled the protests.
And those protests were intense. Serena, walk us through what happened in June 2024 and why it became such a turning point.
June 2024 saw a huge wave of mobilization, led heavily by Gen Z and online movements under hashtags like #RejectFinanceBill2024. Protests moved quickly from tweets to the streets across Nairobi and other cities. On June 25th, a crowd converged on Parliament. Parts of the grounds were breached and set on fire. Police responded with live ammunition and tear gas. Rights groups reported over 20 deaths that day, and later tallies put the death toll for the full wave around 65. The unrest forced Ruto to withdraw the bill and call for concessions, a major political climb-down that showed the limits of a purely technocratic command approach.
David, what does a retreat like that say about state capacity, the ability to plan and execute, versus state fragility?
It reveals a tension. On one hand, the government can design complex fiscal packages and talk to international lenders like the IMF about programs to stabilize debt. On the other hand, it lacks the social legitimacy and the finely tuned political channels to mobilize support for painful measures. If a government is forced into a U-turn by street pressure, it suggests that either communication failed, policy sequencing was flawed, or the social contract is too weak to translate technocratic plans into accepted sacrifice.
Serena, you live and work with the Singapore story. There's often a temptation by leaders to hold up the miracle as evidence that there are no alternatives to tough measures. Is that a fair way to use Singapore's image?
I don't think it's fair, and it's often misleading. Singapore's path involved deliberate, long-term institution building, and crucially, it required credible enforcement against elites. If you use Singapore as shorthand for "we need discipline," but fail to tackle patronage or to make enforcement credible and impartial, then the comparison rings hollow. Worse, invoking the Singapore model to shame citizens into accepting pain without matching results risks eroding trust further.
Let's talk repression and policing. The source material mentions not just 2024 deaths, but also the 2025 protests sparked by the death of Albert Omondi Ojwang in custody. David, tell us about the 2025 cycle and why it mattered.
In June-July 2025, youth-led protests erupted again, triggered by the death of Albert Omondi Ojwang, a blogger and teacher who died in police custody under suspicious circumstances. The protests escalated into nationwide demonstrations demanding Ruto's resignation, citing continuing anger over the cost of living and a lack of accountability for the 2024 killings. Reports indicate at least 65 people killed, hundreds injured, and over 1,500 arrested during those protests. The state response included live bullets, internet and media restrictions, and bans on live protest coverage. This repeated pattern of violent clampdowns followed by limited concessions deepens distrust in state institutions.
Serena, does the pattern of harsh police responses without institutional reform undermine any claim to be building a Singapore-like state?
Yes, it does. Singapore's order is premised on predictable rule of law and low levels of police violence in protest contexts, in part because protests are tightly managed and rare. In Kenya, repeated episodes of lethal force, disappearances allegations, and bans on media coverage create a reality of repression without the counterbalancing institutional cleanliness or service delivery that makes repression palatable to a citizenry. It doesn't look like measured discipline. It looks like coercion without legitimacy.
David, earlier you mentioned IMF programs and fiscal constraints. How much of Ruto's policy choices have been shaped by external lenders versus internal political calculations?
A mix of both. Kenya's high debt and revenue pressures, with debt servicing taking a big share of revenues, create real constraints that push governments toward expanding the tax base and containing deficits. IMF programs emphasize revenue mobilization, subsidy rationalization, and deficit reduction, so there is genuine external pressure. At the same time, internal political calculations shape which taxes are proposed, how fast reforms are implemented, and whether elites are targeted. The 2024 finance bill's design and timing suggest some misreading of political sensitivity. Halting it under pressure shows domestic politics ultimately trump external technical advice.
Serena, are there parts of the Singapore model that Kenya could realistically pursue without copying the political package?
Absolutely. There are elements that are transferable in adapted forms, investing heavily in human capital and vocational education tailored to growing sectors, improving procurement transparency through digital platforms, streamlining regulations to make investment predictable, concentrating industrial policy in well-chosen hubs rather than trying to spread everything everywhere. But the key is that these require sustained political commitment and the ability to discipline vested interests, and to do that in ways that strengthen, not weaken, democratic accountability.
David, let's be blunt. Is Ruto on track to deliver anything like the economic transformation Singapore achieved, given his record so far?
Not in the short term, and probably not in the exact way Singapore did. Singapore's transformation was about decades of consistent policy, elite discipline, and institutional integrity. Ruto faces structural fiscal constraints, a legacy of patronage politics, and a state apparatus that has struggled with impunity in policing.
His retreat on the finance bill and the recurrent cycles of protest suggest he doesn't yet command the necessary social legitimacy to implement sustained, unpopular reforms. That said, his willingness to engage with fiscal reality, trying to expand the tax base, is not inherently wrong. It's the sequencing, communication, and fairness that have been problematic.
I want to put a direct question to you. Could a Kenyan version of a developmental state be built without curtailing liberties the way Singapore did, or are those trade-offs unavoidable?
I think a Kenyan developmental state can be built that respects democratic freedoms, but it would look different from Singapore. It would need to build credible, independent institutions for anti-corruption, ensure impartial law enforcement, and create incentives for merit-based public service while resisting ethnicized patronage. That requires trade-offs too, tough politics and the disciplining of elites. But you don't have to repeat Singapore's limits on media and assembly to get effective governance. The trick is to build competence while deepening accountability channels, not by shrinking them.
Short reaction, David.
I agree with Serena. Kenya's big advantage is an active civil society and a vibrant media. Paradoxically, these are constraints to authoritarian consolidation, but also necessary checks that, if harnessed, can pressure elites into real reform.
Let's return to youth. Gen Z has been central to recent mobilizations. How does their involvement change the political equation? David?
Gen Z is a new political force, digitally savvy, decentralized, and less tethered to the ethnic loyalties that have historically shaped Kenyan politics. They focus on accountability, police brutality, and the cost of living. Their activism can sustain pressure for reform in ways that traditional opposition politics did not. But sustaining policy change requires not just protests, but institutional reforms and political vehicles that translate youth energy into lasting checks on elite behavior.
Serena, any parallels in Singapore's history where youth movements reshaped policy, or is the context too different?
Singapore's political culture has historically been less protest-driven, and youth activism has rarely forced statewide policy shifts in the way we see in Kenya. That difference stems from political structures and media environments. So while youth in Singapore, as elsewhere, push for change, the mechanisms differ. In Kenya, youth energy can be a decisive force because it fills a gap in accountability that formal institutions sometimes fail to provide.
A short one. Wow. Powerful.
Yeah.
I want to zoom in on a line from Ruto when he withdrew the finance bill. Listening keenly to the people of Kenya, who have said loudly that they want nothing to do with this finance bill 2024, I concede. And therefore, I will not sign the 2024 finance bill and it shall subsequently be withdrawn. Serena, does that sound like political learning or political weakness?
It can be read both ways. Retreating under pressure can show responsiveness, and a leader constrained by democratic forces. That's a healthy aspect of democracy. But repeated retreats without addressing root causes can also signal weakness and poor policy design. The key test is whether the government follows up with meaningful engagement, transparent redesign of reforms, and accountability measures for the violence that accompanied the protests.
David, quick. Does the IMF angle change public perception? People often say it's the IMF forcing taxes. How real is that narrative?
The IMF does push for fiscal sustainability measures, but that doesn't mean it dictates policy design. Conditional lenders emphasize revenue mobilization, deficit reduction, and reforms that increase domestic revenue, but governments choose which taxes to raise and how to communicate and mitigate impacts. Blaming the IMF alone simplifies the political choices that Kenyan leaders make.
Let's talk about optics. Lavish convoys, expensive trips, elites living large. How damaging is this for the hustler brand Ruto ran on? Serena?
Extremely damaging. When citizens are asked to accept austerity, visible elite luxury undercuts the moral case for shared sacrifice. It breeds cynicism. If sacrifices are unequal, why trust promises of shared future gains? Messaging alone won't fix that. Visible, credible steps to curb elite excess or to prosecute corruption are necessary to restore trust.
David, do you think Ruto's austerity gestures, cutting some departmental budgets, dissolving some state corporations, were meaningful or mostly symbolic?
They were partly symbolic and partly pragmatic. Cutting visible items like renovations and some corporate boards sends a message, but without deep structural changes, like disciplining top allies or reclaiming lost assets, the cuts are limited in fiscal impact and in political symbolism. They help politically, but they don't replace the long, hard work of institutional reform that would shift incentives.
Short beat. Okay, final stretch. If becoming Singapore is the wrong dream, what does a realistic Kenyan miracle look like? Serena.
A realistic Kenyan miracle would focus on incremental, regionally targeted industrial hubs, huge investments in education and skills aligned to those hubs, digital governance reforms to reduce procurement leakages, and credible anti-corruption processes that are independent. It would also involve smart social protections during reform, so the poor aren't the primary bearers of adjustment costs. In short, a Kenya-specific path that builds state capability while protecting democratic liberties.
David, one last practical checklist. 3 things Kenya must get right if it wants to credibly claim any midterm transformation.
First, credible anti-corruption enforcement that targets elites and recovers assets. Second, durable fiscal reform that is progressive in design, broadening the base but protecting the poorest, and sequenced with visible social investments. Third, police and justice reform to restore trust. Stop lethal crackdowns. Investigate deaths in custody like Albert Ojwang's case transparently and ensure accountability for abuses.
Serena, any closing thought from the Singapore perspective?
Be cautious about analogies. Singapore offers important lessons: good planning, anti-corruption, targeted industrial policy, but it's not a universal template. Kenyan leaders invoking Singapore need to be specific about which elements they will adopt, how they'll tackle patronage, and how they'll respect democratic rights while building capacity.
David, closing line?
Ruto's Singapore rhetoric is rhetorically powerful, but the politics and institutions of Kenya are very different. The question isn't whether Kenya can copy Singapore, it's whether Kenya can craft a credible, accountable developmental path suited to its history, demographics, and political economy. That's the real work.
Thank you both. This has been a dense but essential conversation. Quick checkout. Listeners, think about this. Would you accept stricter discipline if it came with real accountability and improvements in your daily life? Or would you demand that democracy and rights remain non-negotiable? We'll keep following this story. David, Serena, thank you.
Thank you, Amina.
Thanks, Amina.
That's it for today's episode of Policy Street. If you found this useful, share with a friend and send us your questions. I'm Amina Wanjiku. Stay curious, stay engaged.